Hi, I'm Spencer Christian. On this episode of Tracks Ahead, we'll visit a detailed version of the Union Pacific's Sherman Hill area. We'll stop by a reclaimed logging railroad in the shadow of Washington's Mount Rainier, and we'll talk with a man who's regarded by many as the best living railroad photographer. But first, let's head south of the border for a luxurious ride through one of the true wonders of nature, Mexico's Copper Canyon.
It is longer than the Grand Canyon. It is wider than the Grand Canyon. And it is deeper than the Grand Canyon. In fact, you could fit almost 4 of them into the Copper Canyon. The vistas here rival anything you'll find anywhere. And unless you really want some serious exercise, the only way from end to end is by train.
It was spectacular, and as the cliffs almost became like statues. They were so rugged and all these sort of spiral jutting out as the formation, whether it's the water or whatever, but it was almost as though you were looking at a whole lot of statues going along it. It was wonderful.
It lies a couple hundred miles south of Tucson, Arizona. Trains Unlimited Tours runs charters through the rugged canyon several times each year. This is December in the Copper Canyon, or Barranca del Cobre. This winter means flowers are in bloom and the canyon is coated with varying shades of green. And since this is not the United States, all parts of the train are accessible. Riding the nose of the train or on the side of the engine is a rare experience not to be missed. From this vantage point, you get to see the canyon as it unfolds before you. While the sound of the powerful diesel is extreme, what strikes you is the gentle scent of flowers on the wind, not something you would ever experience cooped up in a passenger coach. It is a trip of a lifetime, but for some, once is just not enough. For some, the rail trip through the Copper Canyon is something personal and something to be revisited like a good friend.
I first made this trip in 1966 on a 2-car rail diesel car train. For 34 years, I waited to come back to see especially the Tamarese area. I'm back.
The Tamarese Loop, or El Lazo, is a spectacle of engineering genius. For Lee Johnson, it was something he had to see again. The loop is a 180-degree turn inside solid rock. It's just part of the 406-mile route that includes 86 tunnels and 37 bridges.
The line starts out at about 49 feet above sea level at Los Mochis. At one point, it's 8,071 feet high. This is done with no cog and no switchbacks. It's all done by adhesion. It's quite a climb.
He found out about this trip in Popular Mechanics magazine back in the 60s. The rail line was begun in the early 1870s. It took 90 years to complete. Originally, this line was meant to connect Topolobampo Bay in Sinaloa, Mexico, with Topeka, Kansas. It would shorten the existing route from Kansas City to San Francisco by more than 400 miles. Today, the line is used by locals to get through the canyon, and it is a special destination for tourists. But do not think this trip is like heading out to places like Cancun or Cabo San Lucas. It's rough and basic once you get off the train. While there are some lovely hotels that cater to the tourist trade, Lee Johnson says he can't see many changes since he rode these rails in the 1960s. It's incredible, and these pictures cannot truly do it justice, and adjectives seem to fall short. It is a hard place to put into words.
You can't. It's something you gotta see. It's wilderness, but until you see the rock formation, the flowers that are blooming along the way, you really can't give a person an idea. Film, camera film, video will give you somewhat of an idea. But I think until you experience the ride, you really don't understand it.
John Farley! Morgans! Newmark, Sherrod, Schneider, Warren, Gobler, and the family on the first bus.
There are stops along the way. The Mirador Hotel is seemingly carved out of the canyon's rim. The view at sunrise is not to be missed. From this modern hotel, you can see homes of the Tarahumara Indians. They live simply in primitive conditions. Years ago, these natives had the chance to get electricity and fresh water run into their homes. They turned it down in order to keep living the old way.
It's amazing their tenacity to live in that environment.
All rail trips have a certain historic feel to them, the sense that you're traveling in an older, classic style. Riding through the Copper Canyon, there's the sensation that time has stopped and that you're locked in a different age.
But I think that's what attracted us to this holiday, was that it was going to be real Mexico rather than the tourists, the beaches, which we're not beach people. And it was the thought of we were going to see a real part that hadn't been altered very much.
Inside the cars, food is served in the grand tradition of the railroads. Fresh ingredients are cooked up by the chef below in the galley. And outside, through the domed windows, the canyon and all its wonders are your constant companion. At many of the stops, you'll find local crafts, but none of the crowds you normally associate with tourist stops like these. You'll also find music and native performances. Some of the stops along the route include old colonial villages like Sarakawi at the edge of the Urique Canyon, the deepest part of the Copper Canyon system. This mission church dates back into the 15th century. Step into the cool quiet. The altar is still intact and dates back to the mid-1700s. The village was founded by Jesuits in 1694. Here, you get another glimpse and yet another version of life in and around the Copper Canyon. It is just a few miles by cliff-clinging bus ride to one of the most spectacular sights of the canyon. The Cerro del Gallego Urique lookout puts you at 7,500 feet. It is a breathtaking view. Nothing stands between you and the depths of the canyon. And you might think, Grand Canyon? Now, this is a Grand Canyon. Eventually, you roll out of the canyon and into the flat expanses of Mexico. Here, the sky seems to stretch into infinity, and the sunsets fill the frame of the train window with a portrait no artist could match. As the sun fades and you realize this trip is nearly over, you might realize that this is a trip you want to make again.
Some say that men have a natural tendency to collect things, coins, stamps, magazines, or sports-related items. Well, it's time to meet a California man who was collecting top-of-the-line brass model railroad cars, which he then put in a display case in his office. One day he decided, what's the point of collecting these things if I can't see them in action?
Welcome to the Wyoming division of the Union Pacific Railroad. You're in a time tunnel, and you may pick whatever year you'd like, from the late 1930s to the mid-1960s. These are the often barren and wide-open spaces of Wyoming railroading. What you're looking at is a combination of the memories and the fantasies of John Gray.
Well, when I grew up in Boise, Idaho, I used to take the train back and forth between Boise and South Bend, Indiana, where I went to school. And Cheyenne, Wyoming was the point on the Union Pacific Railroad where all of the great big locomotives ran. In steam days, with big boys, and in turbine days, it was the large gas turbines. And in diesels, they ran the world's largest diesels there. So I couldn't resist on my way to and fro South Bend, Indiana. My brother and I would jump off the train, spend a few hours there, and catch the next train east or west, depending on the direction we're going, and wander around the Cheyenne roundhouse and yards.
John has such fond memories of the big blow turbines, the first and second generation diesels, and the double-engined giants that pulled those trains back then. So years later, in the 1980s, he began collecting brass models of the Union Pacific Railroad cars. When he decided to put that collection into motion, he decided that he wanted it to be big, and he wanted it to be first class. He wanted to run long, heavy brass model trains that had a tendency to be somewhat finicky. The track would have to be flawless, so there wouldn't be derailments. It took some experimentation.
We found that the homosote and plywood kept moving all of the time. And in order to run the long passenger trains and the big steam engines we run on this layout, everything had to be absolutely stable. So we started over again with a splined roadbed, which is essentially 1/4-inch plywood, ripped about 3 inches wide in long strips, glued together and then bolted together and put in vertically where the track would run. And the advantage of the spline roadbed is that you can create long, continuous strips, 30, 40, 50 feet long, by gluing and bolting these splines together and then just bending them around the curves that you want to run and create the super elevations that you would like. So you end up with something that's both very stable and without any abrupt changes in curvature or elevation to ensure a smooth roadbed. On top of that, we placed cork roadbed. And the reason we use cork, once again, it's very stable, and secondly, it's very quiet.
It's a one-man operation, which nearly takes up the 26 by 46 foot room it occupies. It's a room which is climate controlled, once again to minimize layout expansion or contraction. The problem-free track is Walther's Code 83, which is nailed and glued to the roadbed. All the joints are soldered and filed. The centerpiece of the layout is a detailed replica of the Cheyenne shop facilities as they existed in the late 1950s. There's a realistic Wyoming mine scene that's a recent addition to the layout. It may be a one-man operation, but it took more than one man to put it together. Phil Gazzano helped build most of the buildings and much of the scenery.
Well, the mine scene is one of my favorite projects that I worked on in this layout. It was quite a challenge. I worked from photographs of the prototype mine and used a little artistic license as far as the buildings, but they follow the prototype fairly closely. It's primarily built of basswood. I can show you underneath and see what that looks like. Quite a bit of work. It consumed about 3 months total construction time, 8-hour days to finish. The coal seam is built of actual coal, lumps of coal, and sprayed with an airbrush. And the other buildings, of course, are also basswood. The material, the fill material is actual prototype fill material from the Cheyenne area. So it is authentic.
The gravel, the rock work is all real. And that started because so many times I tried to explain to people that the rock around Cheyenne, Wyoming, toward Laramie, over the Continental Divide, was pink. And I never got the pink that I wanted. So one day I rented a town car from Hertz and drove up to the top of Sherman Hill, and it turned out to be a thunderstorm, lightning everywhere, and found a gravel pit there by the side of the road and shoveled the trunk of that Lincoln Continental full of about 350 pounds of crushed rock and had it shipped back UPS, and that's the rock that's on this layout. The sand and the rock is all from Sherman Hill near Granite, Wyoming, and it's absolutely pink, and that's the color we used.
Even the backdrop scenery is a work of art, painted by an artist using reference photos taken by Gray when he traveled to wide-open and windswept Wyoming. In fact, John Gray is a railroad man who started his career in the marketing department of the Western Pacific. He left as senior vice president of Intermodal and now owns his own intermodal terminal contracting firm. That firm operates facilities for all the major railroads. It's that knowledge that helps give this layout an impressive level of accuracy. He's a man who knows railroads, both real and imagined.
John Gray says he can't emphasize enough that if you plan to run heavy brass trains, you'd better make sure your roadbed and track work are extremely sturdy and well constructed. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a new coffee table book filled with railroad photographs is worth at least 1,000,000. The book is called One Track Mind: Photographic Essays on Western Railroading. It's a compilation of exquisite pictures by a man regarded by many as the best living railroad photographer in America. We'll meet him in a minute. But first, let's go to Mount Rainier, home of a national park and the highest mountain in the state of Washington. If you go there, we suggest you check out a great scenic railroad.
At 14,000 feet, majestic Mount Rainier towers over everything it surrounds. Chugging through the foothills of this impressive natural wonder is a testament to the ingenuity and creativity of man. The workhorse steam locomotives of the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad. Located in Elby, Washington, about 70 miles south of Seattle on the main route into the national park, the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad cuts a pretty picture when the beauty of nature is the backdrop for the power of steam. The railroad was started up in the 1980s by Tom Murray, who has logging in his bloodline and steam in his heart.
Well, I grew up going up in the woods with my dad, who was a logger, and we had steam railroads, steam locomotives. And when I worked in the woods after World War II, why, everything was still pretty much steam. And as they started disappearing, I thought it would be just a shame if they all disappeared, went into the scrap heap, and that someone should kind of keep track of them and try to preserve some of them.
The 1.5-hour, 14-mile round trip is an excursion into yesteryear. You travel on trains pulled by meticulously maintained antiques.
We do have the only collection of the 3 major geared logging locomotive designs that were built in the United States that are operable. Those are the Shea, the Heisler, and the Climax.
Steam is not just a hobby or a business for Tom Murray, it's a love. Even in his backyard, he has a scaled-down version of an old steam logging railroad.
I think the best way to start, though, is why do we have geared locomotives in the woods? And there are really 3 reasons. One, of course, is the gearing. You know, when you go up a hill, you put your car in low gear. Well, a geared locomotive is always in low gear, although the Climax actually built locomotives that had gear shifts in them. Secondly, the engines that most people remember were rod engines, and they had a long series of driving wheels with a long rod that connected every wheel. Well, this made it very difficult to take very sharp corners or very rough tracks, so which logging railroads were very rough in design and very sharp corners, so the geared locomotive could get over track that a rod engine couldn't. And then the third and quite important deep part of a geared engine's makeup is the fact that all of the wheels are powered.
Well, each designer came up with their own version of what would be the best way to transfer power from the steam engines to the drive wheels using gears and drive shafts. The whole idea of gearing and drive shafting is that the trucks would be able to swivel and move quite a bit as compared to a stiff rod locomotive. The gearing was designed to put the locomotives into low gear all the time. Top speed of these locomotives varies from about 12 to 18 miles an hour, the Shea being the slowest and the Heisler with a slightly higher gear ratio and larger drive wheels being the fastest.
The passion behind the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad is clearly evident. It's a mandatory stop for those who admire the history of steam and the beauty of nature. The first thing you'll notice about Ted Benson's new book is that it's simple black and white in the midst of an all-color world.
I think it's just a way of looking at things. You know, it's different, it's abstract, it tends to lean more toward the dramatic. It's not a comfort zone. You're used to seeing things in color, and when you see them reduced to black and white and scales of gray, it makes you think more about what's in the image.
It's the allure of trains. The power, the majesty, the size, the sound, the smell that captivates our attention. It fascinated our fathers and mothers, and it will fascinate our sons and daughters. Maybe it's because trains go from coast to coast and mountaintop to mountaintop. Maybe it's because trains don't stop running just because it's cold outside. Trains don't bed down for the night they fire up. And the only thing that's nearly as interesting as the trains themselves are the people who work them. The eye, the mind, and the camera of Ted Benson brings the railroad to life.
Every shot's different. Sometimes it's just a simple, a simple depiction of this is a really pretty place, the light's just nice, and the only thing that would make it better is a train going by, and hey, the train just went by. Other times, if you're in a situation where there's a lot of human interest going on, say maybe like covering the last run of a passenger train, or the first run of an Amtrak train or something like that. The human activity is what's central to the story as opposed to the train. The train just kind of falls off into the background. The people are what make railroading the industry that it is, and you have people that have worked there all of their life, and once they get over the fact that you're not just another goofball with a camera, and they get used to you being there, and once you've got the access and the people open up to you, I mean, it's just, it's a piece of living history, and when, what you're trying to do is document that. I would have to say, some of the work is journalism, but, a fair amount of it is documentary as well. For me, telling the story of a railroad doesn't necessarily mean, there's the obvious story that you do have to tell in terms of the rolling stock and the equipment and the geographic locations, and I mean, it's all important, but it's that human element that, makes people want to work for a railroad, or people just have a avocational interest and just be, intrigued enough to want to, go down to the station and watch trains go by, or go out and, jump in the car and chase a freight train down the highway, or, sit on the side of a hill and wait 5 hours for the next one to roll by.
Ted Benson has been taking pictures of trains for nearly 30 years. His pictures are sort of like souvenirs. They complement his memories and ours. And he's as powerful with his pen as he is with his camera. A talented writer and photographer, Ted Benson wrote all the copy in the book as well. When we look at a picture, we all see what we want to see. What did Ted Benson see? What does he want us to see?
The real storytelling image that night was the two kids in the car, and they just, nothing posed about it at all. They were fascinated by the train, but terrified enough that they really didn't want to get out and get too close to. They were quite happy to stay in the car and watch the engine switch back and forth. And there's a lot of long hours away from home. There's a lot of isolation. You see the train go by and the engineer waves, and it's, oh, that must be the greatest job in the world. And what you don't see, 14 or 16 hours held away from home at your, the outside terminal waiting for a train to come in so you can go back home and get back to your family. There was just this image of this mother and her son just, transfixed in this window, and, the only thing that, mattered, was just, watching this train. They were just totally oblivious to everything around them. And that's one of my all-time favorite images right there. That just says so much, not just about the train and the railroad, obviously, but the parents going out with children and passing the love of trains on to the next generation. And it says a lot to me about my own childhood and growing up, and that's pretty much what drove that shot.
The book is the first in a Masters of Railroad Photography series, which will be published by Boston Mills Press. Thanks for being with us, and please join us next time for more Tracks Ahead.